Interview. I'm Caitlin, if you haven't figured that out. Um, so to give you a brief overview, I did this on two students. Permission was given for conducting the interview for educational purposes. I chose two students because I wanted to develop a deeper understanding on students who are bilingual. Also, I thought it was an opportunity to build a deeper relationship with them. I dove into home and school influences on their language usage, then the advantages and disadvantages they feel from being bilingual, and other things that kind of had similarities between both students that really stood out to me. Okay, so here's a brief view once again of how the presentation will go with 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I just also wanted to note, this interview was conducted as a discussion. Some conversations were in Spanish and some of the discussion occurred in English. Both students, when describing experiences with their family, I noticed had more of a tendency to describe them in Spanish to me than in English. So I thought that point really stood out to me. So the backgrounds, these are my two students. This is Camila and Naide. They're both 13 years old. Something that stood out to me was they both said their age in Spanish over telling me their age in English. They're both born in Puerto Rico. They both live in Rochester, but they both actually moved to the US when they were 4. Both languages that they speak are Spanish and English. And I said that they both answered in Spanish and English as well. I also wanted to mark the key points that both students also believed themselves. They speak both languages fluently, and they have the ability to read and write at grade level in both languages. I did a little deeper dive into that by talking to their English teachers to see if they were on grade level. They are both in 7th or 8th grade now. These two students do not receive any interventions. If you don't know what an intervention is, it's called ESL. It's English to speakers of another language. They don't receive those services. So I did want to make that as a point. Typically, if you are somebody learning English, you would receive ESL services. Both students also demonstrated their control of each language in the interview. I wanted to give you a little map overview of Puerto Rico. Camila's from San Juan and Naide's from Ponce. So that's just a quick little map to help you out, or if you can make any connections, if anyone's been anywhere. So they speak Puerto Rican Spanish. I Googled this a little further because I asked them and they weren't too in depth about what their own dialect is, but Canarian Spanish and Andalusian. Now it's important to note that in school, Castilian is more taught and some words are different than others, especially with the school language that Spanish is taught in, which in class, I do have them as students, and in class, they always are quick to argue. No, that's not the word. But we just try to express there are other words. So a little background information on them. Camila identifies with the pronoun she, her. She's very sociable. She has many friends and described herself as an active participant in all her classes. She is always eager to learn. She loves to read and write in both languages. She enjoys music in Spanish and English, and she regularly visits Puerto Rico to see family. When I asked her how she identified, she said, I am Puerto Rican, seasoned with Americanish, which I thought was interesting and kind of cute. Naide identifies with the pronouns he and him. Naide is shy at first, but then once you get to know him, he is more outgoing. He loves to help people in any way he can. Naide loves listening to bachata. If you don't know bachata, very, very popular Hispanic music. And if you haven't heard it before, it's awesome. He always recommends it in Spanish class to me. Naide enjoys Flash, the TV show, in Spanish only in Spanish. And he regularly visits Puerto Rico and enjoys the feeling of being somewhere where he can always see and hear Spanish. When I asked him about his identity, he straight up said, I am Puerto Rican. So to go into home life and school life, I split these up by both students. So to start off, um, Camila's home life, she lives with both parents who do speak Spanish. She described that her parents educated her with reading, writing, and speaking because she described her usage of Spanish to be 75% at home. This is because she speaks English with her older sister. Also, her parents are older, therefore, they have limited English, and her parents continue to want to learn English. So, Camila tends to talk with them a lot more at times in English, but she does usually say that she talks mainly Spanish with them. Camila watches a lot of TV in English, and Camila noted that in her house, she tends to mix in English words when talking in Spanish. I said this represents her ability to code mix, but at times, as I'll get into it, in her like disadvantage point, we'll figure out why she kind of does at times do a little code mixing. For school life, I think this was the most fascinating parts of the interview. She did explain that it felt like English was shoved down her throat, and that's her quotation. Camila attended a bilingual school here in the US when she was younger. She mentioned K through 4, she had Hispanic teachers who taught everything, but they wouldn't focus on Spanish directly. They focused on English in those teachings. She expressed people were trying to get accustomed to the American culture, so English was their priority. I asked her what her favorite class is, and she did say English because she stated, I actually feel like I'm learning something. She mentioned that it's interesting to learn words that she is not aware of in Spanish. She brought up the word tedious. She said words like these do increase her Spanish vocabulary as well. So like when she hears these words in English or she learns about them, she's more willing to want to get to know them in Spanish as well. She said words, no, math is easier to her because it's numbers and she doesn't necessarily have to think in both languages at all. For her school life, I did ask them about their friendships, and Camila said that her friends in school are mostly gringos. And that's kind of just necessarily people who don't speak Spanish and they're white. So those are typically her friends. She did not want me to be offended, which I thought this was a cute note about not choosing Spanish, but she says it's too easy. She is in level 1, which it's very hard. And I don't think our own schooling system, as we've like seen in class, doesn't really serve bilingual students well. They don't even really have the chance to test out, or they're not willing to test them out quickly of a lower level of Spanish. Like she could be definitely in level 3, but I guess it's just the process that makes it so difficult. And usually they're not even willing to do it because it's just more work on their part. But hopefully she does start to enjoy it as she gets older in higher levels. But I just thought that was an interesting note to take. So for Naide said he uses 90% of Spanish in his household. The 10% portion of not speaking Spanish is because he speaks English more with his little brother, which would make sense because Naide's already 13, moved here when Naide was 4. So like little brother probably has very limited exposure to Spanish in general, other than in the household. And so therefore, Naide tends to speak more English with him like all the time. Mom is only strictly only Spanish with Naide because she doesn't know much English. And then his mom did not want him to forget the language, so he mentioned nunca. That's never, never speak English in the house. So Naide is like not supposed to speak English in the house in front of mom. School life. Naide mentioned he was in a daycare in Santa Marta, Puerto Rico. Naidi described his English use in school as 90%. The other 10% is used with Naide's Hispanic friends who he's very close with, and they talk in Spanish all the time whenever they see each other. And especially because, as I mentioned down below, he sits only with his friends who speak Spanish at lunch. So yeah, it's only about 42 minutes of the day, but sitting at a lunch table and only speaking Spanish during that time. There are other times he's talking in Spanish, like in Spanish class, he usually only speaks Spanish. And what else? Train of thought. Sorry. But in the passing times or in other classes, he has Hispanic friends as well, and he will speak Spanish with them. Nadia described, Nadia did go to bilingual school, sorry, growing up. Spanish was actually switched every day, he said. Then it switched to subject specific. So science was Spanish, math was English, social studies was English. And then Naide felt if math and social studies was taught in Spanish currently, he would have an easier time in those subjects within school. And I found that to be interesting because, as we've talked about in class, specific subjects that students work in with their native language, it might actually be more beneficial to them to be in their dominant language, learning any concepts that might be taught that they don't understand. Then answering in his old school, which was also very helpful to him, was that if he didn't understand anything, it would be able to be explained in Spanish to him. And he doesn't have that luxury in his schooling right now. So in his schooling right now, he doesn't really have any assistance to translate math, especially, he brought up. He said that math is especially difficult, any reading math problems. He felt like, if I just had somebody there to speak to me in Spanish to elaborate on some of the points or describe it differently, that he feel like he would understand it a lot quicker. So I thought that was also very interesting. Naide's favorite class is Spanish. He feels like he can embrace his culture in this class, although he argues that the Spanish we learn is not his Spanish. So that's basically the home life and school life portion of both students. A key point to highlight is what is different about the Spanish you learn in school and the Spanish you grew up with. Specific pronunciations of words. It could be like the dropping of vowel or vowels towards the end, like especially letters with S's, he always says. Especially more formal, that's the biggest argument, is that nobody talks that formal. And then some words are different than others to describe specific things. So I just wanted to elaborate on that a little bit, just briefly. So the bilingual use advantages and disadvantages portion, starting with Camila. Advantages of being bilingual. Camila believed she was very proud to be it. That was an advantage. She believes it gives her also the ability to communicate with a wider range of people. And then she is also able to help her parents learn English, to basically help them better their lives here if they ever need help with anything. Some disadvantages, which I noticed there were a little more disadvantages than there were advantages that she felt. Camila said that as she learns English, it tends to have an effect on her ability to remember Spanish. She finds herself forgetting a simple word and has to use circumlocution with her mom to help her try to reach that word. She will mainly refer to hand gestures to help her describe the word she is talking about. One scenario she mentioned was the word pan. She was like, I could not remember it. I kept using my hands. I tried to describe it to her. And then she said she finally got around to the word, and she even was like, oh, I knew that. And it just like didn't come to her in that moment. She said that a disadvantage is that she would actually prefer her classes to be taught in her L1 because she's feeling disassociated with her Spanish and schooling. I found that to be like kind of sad because as we know, like we want everyone to embrace their bilingual abilities and help them through the process of like learning both languages or being a part of both languages. So I just found that to be kind of disheartening knowing that she does feel so disassociated with Spanish in her schooling. So it makes me want to make like a bigger influence on her when she is in Spanish class to help her the best I can. Um, I asked them questions on choice of words, and Camila mentioned that if she does swear, even though she's not supposed to, she does this in Spanish. She believes she chooses this because she mainly hears her parents swear at her. And she was all like, oh, if you hear a parent swear at you in Spanish, you know you're in trouble and you know you're going to remember it. In addition, she believes if she swears in school, no one understands it. Therefore, it's totally her preference. Um, Camila feels we dived into a little bit about the I love you scenario, and Camila feels that I love you in English is actually more powerful than in her dominant language. And she felt that people in Spanish say te amo too much to each other. So I actually found that very interesting. And I kind of like really was trying to think about it as to why te amo, like to her, is not as strong as like I love you, or why she believes that, you know, if you say it too much in Spanish, and maybe it's due to her family moving here and she was young and maybe she got accustomed to the belief of like we say I love you too much. But I don't know, it's worth further discoveries. But it got me thinking. So for Naide's advantages were that being bilingual allows him to help other Spanish folks, he said, communicate. And then he also mentioned he is more willing to want to learn another language, specifically ASL, American Sign Language. So he believed that like, because he knows Spanish, because he knows English, he's more able to like want to learn another language or has that willingness to dive into something else. Now, Camila, to go back to her really quick, she is somebody who is hard of hearing. Therefore, she already does like really try to learn ASL. She's only in the beginning portions of it, but she does want to learn it as well because she obviously has a hearing deficit and she really thought it would help her in her future. Some disadvantages is thinking in both languages makes it hard to focus. And Naide brought up that people only see you as a one language person. And I thought that was super powerful because he mentioned that most of the time, because he speaks English now, people only see him as an English speaker and they don't even debate whether or not he knows Spanish at any capacity. He said that usually people are shocked when he like starts speaking Spanish and he's like, yeah, I know Spanish. And he kind of just wishes that people just saw you as a person who was bilingual and it's more able to be seen as, oh, you can be here in the United States and speak more than one language and more than just English. He also said he sometimes gets confused when having to translate for family members. Naide brought up that his angry language is Spanish. He described it as malas palabras and did not use the word swearing, bad words. He feels he knows more words in Spanish that are bad. And then he said, te amo is I love you, has more meaning in Spanish because Naide views Spanish as a love language. I know I'm on time here. I set a timer. Okay. Quick points, case of Spanglish they brought up, accent and translating. They feel that there are words that have been made up, like they say basement, and that's not the word for basement in Spanish, it's sótano. And Naide looked at me and was like, never heard that word in my life. Camila was like, you've never heard that word. But they just both brought up the fact that from being here, they kind of have this case of Spanglish, that they've kind of mixed both languages. And then accent wise, they mentioned that they could tell what person's dominant language is, especially if it's Spanish or not. And that really helps them decide which language to use, whether they'll speak in English or Spanish to somebody. And then they did mention their own accent has changed since learning English, and they do have a difficult time with some pronunciation of English words that they've noticed. Both the students agree that translating English to Spanish is more difficult than translating Spanish to English because they have to translate new words they didn't know in Spanish. Lastly, culturally, it was understanding Sweet 16 is more highlighted in the US than their focus of a quinceañera. They see less Spanish in the US, but they love how much they see in Puerto Rico on billboards, people talking in Spanish. And then for their futures, Naide wants to teach his kids Spanish first. And then Camila wants to have both parents express a thing in one language, then have the child ask the other parent in English. This is how she learned Spanish, and she wants to continue to teach it like that in her own future. And then Camila and Naide feel that they know more English words than Spanish words. They both feel that since they both grew up here, it has helped grow their L1 with vocabulary still because they learn English. Also, they find it easier to spell in English. So that was really getting me to think, like, are they balanced bilinguals or not? I do firmly believe they are bilingual, but I do want to say at some point, they might reach being more dominant in English. Just a quick diagram to the bottom right. This is how actually Camila drew this out and how she described her language learning. She said that Spanish are like the bubbles, like they were there, but these little white dash lines, that's her English. So like she was already filling up her cup basically with Spanish, and English just tends to fill in those missing lines from what she's learned in Spanish. Hopefully that makes sense. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask. These are some photos. This is Naide on the left. Naide's goofy, fun. And then Camila is on the top right. And that's just a little photo with me and the both of them. Thank you. And do you have any questions? I'm sorry that was so monotone and boring. But any questions? Oh,
Good. Thank you. Okay, that was interesting. All right, questions and comments?
Was that a positive, interesting? Yeah.
Hi, Kathleen. I heard that in your thanks for the presentation. There's one example in your presentation that one of your interviewees say that the Spanish used in the academic setting is actually not his Spanish. Can you explain it a little bit?
Yeah. So basically, I mean, even Brenda, if you want to add in, because I know like you've been in the sequence of learning English, and you taken Spanish classes?
Yeah, I took
And
Spanish in high
and I
school.
know-
for years.
Did you connect with anything mentioned about feeling like the Spanish was not the same between any words, dialect, pronunciation?
Yeah, so they teach at my school specifically, they teach us Spanish from Spain, which is like different words for what we say in the Dominican Republic. So for example, like you said basement. We don't have basements in the Dominican Republic, so that word is not in our vocabulary at all. We didn't know what that is. But I do find that in Puerto Rico, since Puerto Rico has correct me if I'm wrong, but they have a lot of people that speak English now because it's part of America. So they have more of a Spanglish than in DR, I believe. So they have like, for example, like mop. I know that they say mapo. Like we don't say that. We say something completely different. So they have more like English influence than in the Dominican Republic. In each different country, like I've worked with people from Ecuador, and they have completely different words, and they have a lot of words that have to do with like they had different, I don't know who they were colonized by, but I know that they had different influences because they had more like native influence than what we had. So every little country, they have different accents and different words that they use.
I mean, Lizzie, I know you teach Spanish with me, and I like am blanking on a specific word to bring up, but if you have one, go for it. Not
Yeah.
to put you on the spot.
I always think of, I had this huge argument with one of my students from a few years ago when I had to teach the word bacon. We were learning about breakfast foods, and I said the word bacon, and in Spain they call it tocino, and she was like, no, 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 I would never say that word. That's not even a word. I'm like, yes, it is, and she would not accept it.
Yeah, the most important thing in this presentation, and even your comments right now, is that everything is around words. So words, 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 words. That's the most important thing. When they describe how they learn English, they learn basically, it didn't change the concepts, they just learned the English word. And they realize that, okay, sometimes there is no equivalent. I think they mentioned the basement, you already mentioned that, but the tedious example was also important, because she said that, okay, she didn't know the word tedious, and probably there is no very close equivalent in Spanish to that word. So after all, that's the interesting thing. And the language, the new labels, and this is where the important thing is, that the new labels do not change your identity. What will change your identity if you are ready to reconceptualize certain things in your mind, because the new labels just give you the chance to kind of move around in the new environment. But how you understand those new words, what is behind, and that is basically Puerto Rican. This is a Puerto Rican way of understanding the world around you. So after all, the girl Camilla was interesting when she said that she's Puerto Rican with an Americanish kind of touch or whatever she referred to. So that's a good definition of what is happening here, because as you see, the language learning process here is basically picking up new words. It would have been very interesting to look into, of course, we don't expect you to do that, but just hypothetically, it would be very interesting to look into their academic language, because that academic language is connected with English. So their academic knowledge is connected with English, since their academic knowledge comes through English. Again, I refer to Camilla, who said that basically she feels like disconnected somehow in the school because she doesn't use Spanish. So everything is in English. So the point is that the question is how much conceptualization comes through the English language as far as academic knowledge is concerned. Because as far as everyday life is concerned, their Puerto Rican-based concepts will not change. They do not change. And that makes their identity. However, probably on the academic side, there is much more conceptualization as far as the knowledge that they pick up in the school is concerned. So these are interesting situations, because they will never become Americans, and they don't want to. Why should they? So again, I refer to the girl who said that she's proud of her bilingualism, so she's bilingual. So that's something that they appreciate, and they appreciate knowing two languages, but at the same time, they are Puerto Rican. So that is how it is. So and you may remember when we briefly talked about identity, that I told you that you have only one identity. There are no two identities or three identities or whatever. You have a very flexible identity which changes under the influence of the environment and according to your preference and willingness to kind of make changes. in your identity yourself, because you know if you you understand the new world around you, but you want to be a part of it only to some extent, you know, because you want to keep who you are. So that is how it happens. Okay, any more questions to Caitlin? Or comments, if you have any? The two people were quite interesting. They were a little bit different, of course, you know, but that is good, you know. So their approach, their understanding, the new environment was different. This is how it should be. They are independent individuals. Okay, if there is no more, then thank you very much, Caitlin. Thank you for the presentation. And right now, we change the scene and we give the chance to Elizabeth to make a presentation. So please take over.
Okay. Can you see my slides?
Yeah. Yes, yes.
Awesome. I know last time when I had to present my interview, I couldn't figure it out, so I'm glad it's working. Okay, let's see here. So let me see if I can make these pictures here smaller. There we go. The article that I had to present on this week was Cultural Effects Rather Than a Bilingual Advantage in Cognition, a Review and Empirical Study. And you can see the authors of the article right there. So the outline for my presentation, first, I'm just going to explain what the bilingual advantage hypothesis is. I'm going to talk about 3 different tasks that they use to study executive functions: the Simon task, Stroop task, and flanker task. Then I will talk about culture and how they propose this as an alternative explanation. I'll go over the study that they conducted, the results of the study, the conclusion, the interpretation that they took away from the study, and then my discussion questions. So the bilingual advantage hypothesis is the belief that bilinguals have higher executive functioning and cognitive skills than monolinguals. The hypothesis has been tested by comparing different groups of bilinguals and monolinguals on tasks that involve inhibition and monitoring. And inhibition is the ability to ignore noticeable but irrelevant information to achieve the task. And I'm going to explain that a little bit more when I show the actual tasks, and you can see what the information is that they have to ignore. And then monitoring is the ability to notice changes and adapt choices to choose the correct response. So in previous studies, they have studied different groups of people. In bilingual children, they have been reported to outperform monolingual children on the different tasks. I listed some of them there, but they have all different kinds of tasks that they use to evaluate their executive functioning skills. Same thing for older adults. They had specifically reported advantages on the Simon task and the spatial Stroop task. In younger adults, there had been advantages reported on some of these tasks, but these were very infrequent, as the young adult group typically did not report a bilingual advantage. So the results from their tests usually showed that they were pretty on the same level with executive functioning as monolinguals. Despite this evidence, recent investigations have cast doubt over the results and whether it is necessarily bilingualism that causes the reported success that is being concluded as a bilingual advantage. So especially the researchers of this study, they wanted to look into if it was actually the ability to speak another language that was causing them to do better on the executive functioning tasks. So the doubts that they had, there were many studies that did not support the bilingual advantage hypothesis, and some even showed opposite results. So they showed the monolinguals achieving better or doing better on the tasks than the bilinguals, especially on large scale studies that involved larger groups of people. The Hawthorne effect was participants' knowledge of tasks may increase the performance, which could lead some researchers appearing to find more evidence of their hypothesis, so being more likely to conclude with positive results. They also discussed a publication bias such as the file drawer effect. So studies that supported an advantage were more likely to be published rather than studies that had null results or results that didn't agree with their hypothesis, they might not get published. And so the researchers were wondering if they were looking at the right skills to compare monolinguals and bilinguals, and what kind of performance advantage should be expected in executive functioning. So the two major doubts that they had and they wanted to study was why young adult bilinguals were never outperforming the monolingual counterparts. So there was very little evidence to show an advantage in this specific age group. And they also mentioned the peak performance hypothesis, which argued that all young adults are already in control of efficient processing. So they have similar levels of executive functioning, no matter how many languages they speak. And then they also wanted to discover what other factors besides bilingualism might account for the results that had been interpreted as a bilingual advantage. So the three tasks that were discussed specifically in the article, the first one was the Simon task. The way that it works is participants are sitting in front of a screen at a computer, and one at a time there will be a square, or in this picture here, circles that appear on the screen, either on the left side, the right side, or in the center. And participants have to respond according to the location, sorry, not to the location, they respond to the color of the square by pressing the appropriate key. So in the picture, you can see that if the square is blue, they would press the left key. If it was red, they would press the right key. So it was a congruent trial if the red square was on the right side of the screen, because that's where you would expect it to be, because you're pressing the right key. So you want it to be on the right side of the screen. An incongruent trial would be the red square on the left side of the screen. So this is where the inhibition comes in. You have to recognize that it's on the wrong side of the screen. It's on the left side, but you have to press the right key. So that's why it's incongruent. And then neutral would be if it appeared in the center, because either color could appear in the center and it's right in between the two keys that you have to press. So this task results in something called the Simon effect, which is when they calculate all the data, they look at the difference in response times between the congruent and incongruent trials, because they expect you to do better and answer quicker for the congruent trials, where it's on the right side of the screen when you're pressing the right key, or the left side when you're pressing the left key. And then you would respond slower if it was an incongruent trial. So the Simon effect is the difference in between those two times. The next one is the spatial Stroop task, which is also very similar to the Simon task, except instead of looking at colored squares, participants would see arrows, typically pointing to either the left or the right, and you have to indicate the direction of the arrow while ignoring where it's located on the screen. In the picture here that I found, it's actually up and down arrows with left and right keys. But typically it would be left or right arrows pressing the left or the right keys. So it's similar to the Simon task, because you have to ignore the location and answer based on which key you're actually supposed to be pressing. So you have to activate the inhibition skills to ignore the location on the screen to get to the correct answer. And then the third one is the flanker component, which was a component of a larger task. So this one specifically, the participants would see a line of arrows, and they have to correctly choose the direction of the center arrow and ignore the other distractors. So in the picture over here on the right, you can see there's 3 arrows right there. The left one and the right one are both pointing to the right, but you have to ignore those arrows and only look at the center, which that arrow is obviously pointing to the left. So you have to press the left key. So the incongruent trials would have the distractors contradicting the target of the center, and you can see the example right there. And then a congruent trial does not have a contradiction, so all the arrows would be facing the same direction. So all 3 of these tasks require the inhibition of salient but task irrelevant information, so the ability to ignore the distractions and get to the correct answer. It takes longer to respond to an incongruent trial than a congruent trial, because you're using that inhibition skill to get to what is actually the correct answer. These tasks also require monitoring skills to adapt to unpredictable changes from the randomized prompts, because they all show up in a random order. The advantages in inhibition are indicated by a decreased Simon or other task-related effect. So having quicker reaction times and less of a difference in response times would indicate better executive functioning skills. And advantages in monitoring are evidenced by faster responding over the task as a whole. These skills are meant to represent one's executive functioning skills. So these are the skills that are being assessed on these different tasks to see how well one is with their executive functioning, basically to test their cognitive abilities. So testing the claim that young adults do not show a bilingual advantage. So first, the authors of this paper, the researchers, reviewed the evidence for a U-shaped curve in bilingual advantages, which I kind of just roughly found a U-shaped curve graph and kind of made this myself here. But basically it shows that at a younger age, you have a higher perceived bilingual advantage. So on most tasks, the younger groups of people would do very well and show a better or higher bilingual advantage. And then as you age, sort of in the middle of your lifetime, the young adult age group shows a lower bilingual advantage. And then as you get older, the bilingual advantages kind of go up again. So that's just the different age groups. So they reviewed specifically studies that had been published that included monolingual and bilingual groups. They measured or defined language proficiency in a quantifiable way, and they included one or more of those 3 tasks that I mentioned. Then they went through and classified the results of those studies into 3 different groups. The yes group supported a bilingual advantage. The no group did not support a bilingual advantage, and the mixed group had conflicting results. And you can see all those different reasons there for why they might be in the mixed group. But after they classified the data into those 3 groups, they created these graphs right here on the slide. So you can see the 4 different graphs. The red lines would represent the no, so the studies that did not support a bilingual advantage. The green line is the yes group, and then the yellow line is the mixed group, obviously. And I just also wanted to note that the children group, the specific ages, were anyone 17 and younger. The adults in the middle represented ages 18 through 40, and then the older adults was anyone over the age of 40. So that was how they split up the age groups. So the interpretation for these graphs right here and the results of their studies of the past studies that had been published, the results did not suggest a clear support for a bilingual advantage in any age group. Overall, less than 35% of all participants showed an advantage in executive functioning. So there was no evidence to support the bilingual advantage based on their results from this study. So they came up with a potential alternative explanation, which was culture. So culture had long been discussed as a potential issue in bilingual advantage studies due to the nature of comparing groups that differ in culture and language. So focusing on the different groups, where they're actually from, and what languages they speak. So the authors noticed through their review of past studies that growing up in an East Asian culture may provide an alternative explanation for some bilingual advantages. Specifically, they mentioned one study where Japanese English bilinguals produced a smaller Simon effect than Spanish English bilinguals, which was interpreted as having higher executive functioning skills for the Japanese English bilinguals. So they chose to create their own study to compare the performance of Korean and British participants, which is the study that I'm going to discuss. So they chose Korea because the Korean educational system has deep roots in Confucianism, which emphasizes self-regulation and inhibition. And these cultural practices might lead to better performance on tasks that involve inhibitory control, or how the tasks that I mentioned involved inhibition and monitoring skills. And other researchers from other studies had found that Korean children outperformed British children on tasks that involved inhibitory control. And this led them to the idea that Koreans outperforming the British is attributable to the experience of Korean culture. So this is why they specifically focused on Korea and the United Kingdom for their 2 different cultural groups in this study. So for the study, they surveyed or recruited young adult bilinguals and monolinguals, and they were trying to test whether the young adult bilinguals would outperform the monolinguals on a Simon task. So that was the first task that I talked about with the different colored squares on the screen. So their hypothesis or their reasoning, they actually had two. The first one was, if bilingualism confers an advantage in domain general executive functioning, then bilinguals should outperform monolinguals. The second is, if Korean participants outperform British participants, then findings with bilingual and monolingual groups of similar cultures that were interpreted as supporting a bilingual advantage may instead have tapped an effect of culture. They also included a third mixed group of culturally heterogeneous participants as kind of a control group to compare three different groups instead of just the Koreans and the British. So the participants involved in the study, they had 215 total participants, 78 were British, 64 were Korean, and 69 were in the mixed group. The mixed group was comprised of people who had spent an average of 26 months in the United Kingdom or other English-speaking countries, and consisted of people from 18 different countries. So it was a very diverse group of people. The British and mixed groups were recruited and tested in the United Kingdom, so they were tested in English. And the Korean group were recruited and tested in Korea, so the test was performed in Korean. This is important because they were testing participants in an L1 context to rule out potential second language context affecting the results. So they made sure that everybody was tested in their first language or their dominant language. So for example, the mixed group, English might not have been their first language, but it was their dominant language based on where they lived. So for measuring the bilingualism, sorry, I had to move this thing on my screen. They had three different measures to measure their bilingualism. So they measured their second language proficiency, their language dominance, and code switching. This allowed them to discern which specific aspects may lead to a bilingual advantage. So they had all of the participants rate their own language proficiency, their daily language use or dominance, and their frequency of code switching. And you can see the results from the self ratings of the participants in this diagram down here. So the higher scores in all three variables would represent higher bilingualism. And this covers all of the participants, no matter which group that they were from. So there's kind of a variation in all three. But they separated the data based on each of those measures of bilingualism to look at what aspects of bilingualism could affect their responses. Two other factors that they took into account for the study was nonverbal IQ. So all of the participants completed the short form of the Advanced Raven Progressives matrices set to account for the factor of nonverbal IQ, which has previously been found to correlate with performance on the Simon task, even when bilingualism does not. This came from their results of a study where Korean children had outperformed British children on measures of nonverbal IQ. So they used that form, they call it the Ravens form, to measure their nonverbal IQ. They also wanted to take into account their socioeconomic statuses because that has been found to correlate positively with performances on tasks that involve executive functioning skills in children and also in children and adults in the absence of a similar effect of bilingualism. So the researchers ensured that they measured and controlled for the factor of socioeconomic status to show that it did not account for the results linked to bilingualism. And all of the participants were recruited through universities, and they were all young adults. So they all actually had very similar socioeconomic statuses. And it's on a later slide, but they ended up not even including this in the data because it was so similar across the board for all the participants. So this is the ratings from the self ratings of the three measures of bilingualism and also the Raven scores. You can see how each group measured in nonverbal IQ in this first chart. And then the other three are the measures of bilingualism. So you can see which groups rated themselves differently in the different measures of bilingualism. So for the actual study, the participants completed the Simon task where they viewed the red and green squares and had to press the keys that corresponded to the correct colors, no matter where they were located on the screen. The researchers were able to measure the participants' Simon effect scores to evaluate their executive functioning. So remember, the Simon effect is the difference in times from the congruent trials and the incongruent trials. After collecting the data from the responses, they used linear mixed effects regression modeling to analyze the data. They also compared their responses to the Raven scores to look at their nonverbal IQ, the 3 bilingualism variables, and the different cultural groups as their fixed factors. Socioeconomic status failed to correlate with any variables and was found to be irrelevant, so it was excluded from the analysis. So the final analyses included 4 fixed factors: congruency, one of the bilingualism variables, nonverbal IQ, and culture. So you can see those 4 things are going to be on the next few slides with all of the numbers of all the data from the results. So overall, the statistically significant Simon effects were found in every group. So basically the Simon task was accurate, showing that they had the fastest responses on the controls where the squares were in the middle, slightly slower responses on congruent trials, and slightly even slower responses on the incongruent trials. The higher nonverbal IQ also predicted better overall performance, and the Korean group outperformed the British group in every way. Sorry, my cat just climbed on the back of my chair here. The Korean group also outperformed the mixed group, and the mixed group outperformed the British group in every way except for global speed. So that supported their theory that the Koreans ended up doing the best on all of the trials. The results also did not support a bilingual advantage and actually showed a disadvantage in most cases. So the groups with higher bilingualism did worse on the trials and on the task. They only measured bilingualism to compare their accuracy and not their response time. So this table shows the overall performance of culture, the different cultural groups, and you can see the British group, mixed group, and Korean group, and all of the Simon effect scores, their accuracy, their response time, all the data. This one shows the effects of nonverbal IQ, so it has their Raven scores compared to each group. This one shows the different cultural groups overall with their Simon effect scores again, and the overall speed. And this last one shows the effects of the bilingualism variables. So it has all 3 different variables and all of the data if you want to look at those. So the conclusion, the study concluded that there was no support for a bilingual advantage in executive functioning skills and found greater evidence for a bilingual disadvantage. The study did find support for their cultural advantage hypothesis because the Korean participants outperformed British participants on every performance measure. This suggests that culture may have driven previous conclusions of a bilingual advantage in similar studies. These findings have important ramifications for previous studies supporting the bilingual advantage, which included a significant amount of bilingual participants from East Asian cultures. However, they do not claim that culture is responsible for all cases in which a bilingual advantage was found. So they put this information out there to show that other studies may be showing a support for bilingual advantage, saying that bilinguals have higher executive functioning skills, even though that may not be true, and the results may have been due to cultural differences. Also, the higher nonverbal IQ scores and better performance from the Koreans over the British supports the theory of the Koreans' cultural background of having an intensive education to provide an advantage to them. There was also no support for the peak performance argument of young adults all doing equally well because they all had varying differences. There was also one quote from the article, which wasn't actually from the people who wrote the article. It was from these 2 people, Bialystock and Grundy. But I thought the quote was very important, so I wanted to include it. It says, "If we are to understand cognition, then it is imperative to understand how it is impacted by experience. Yet of all activities in which humans engage, nothing is as intense or as sustained as using language." And basically they explain that by saying, if language is the most intense cognitive experience of all, then finding an effective culture, but not bilingualism, raises serious questions about whether bilingualism really does confer a performance advantage. They also stated that there's now sufficient evidence to suggest rethinking past research and finding new explanations rather than a bilingual advantage. And they suggested 2 further possibilities to continue studying this. They said that their study was merely suggestive and not comprehensive, and it requires further research into the explanation of a cultural advantage. And also they said that further investigation is also needed to understand why Korean participants performed the best of all 3 groups studied. And I thought it was very interesting that they mentioned looking at the different alphabet systems. So like Latin languages like English that are derived from Latin are phonemic alphabet systems, and Korean is a logographic alphabet system. So that could have relation to their executive function as well. All right, so that is everything from me. I also just have my discussion questions. So my first discussion question is, what are your thoughts on the quote that I put on the previous slide? And I will show it in just a second. And how does that quote relate to the study that I discussed? So this is the quote right here. It's the first bullet point. So if you want to read it again, and then anybody who wants to share, if you have thoughts about why I put the quote on there or how it relates, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, guys, come on.
I can call on somebody. I do it all the time at school. I'll do it. All right, the first person I see, because I have a very limited view, is Ying. So Ying, if you want to share your thoughts, I would appreciate it.
In my humble opinion, that is the cognition is the kind of the reflection of using a language. So maybe if we want to know something that is intensive or sustained in thinking, or that may be by understanding the how people understand something, or something that is impacted by their experiences, or their the content that is they are living in, or the culture, maybe.
Just think about this quote. So it looks complicated, but it is not. So it emphasizes that cognition is impacted by experience. So cognition depends much on experience. However, experience is usually goes through language. So language is the element that actually affects cognition more than anything else. You know, this is what they tried to say, I think, in this quote somehow. So there are these 3 factors: cognition, experience, and language use. You know, and of course, if we accept that cognition much depends on experience, then we have to look at what experience is all about. And most of your experience comes through language, you know. And I again want to quote Vygotsky, who says that when you go to school, language becomes the main regulator of thinking. You know, so language regulates thinking basically, and the language regulates your social cultural experience outside there in the world as well. So you do everything through language. You know, language is there no matter what. You know. Nowadays, language is even in the bathroom, because, you know, when I go to the bathroom, I hear that people are on the phone all the time there. So, you know, they are not without language even in the bathroom, you know. So it's terrible, but that's the truth, you know. So the point is that all your you become so language dependent. And think about the the iPhones, the internet and everything. That's language in front of you, mainly, okay? So you read that all the time. You interact with people all over the world, you know, and in your smaller and wider environment. So and you use language. So everything that you do is connected with language and depends on language, you know. So after all, the quote is quite okay.
Thank you. All right, so my second question is, what do you think about their suggestion that culture is a possible reason for higher executive functioning? Is this a better explanation for a perceived bilingual advantage? All right, I guess I have to pick somebody again.
Not usually quiet today, but you know, this is a very, very important, and I don't know why people haven't looked into this question yet. You haven't read my book, Foreign Language and Mother Tongue. I think Han did. And you remember, Han, that I talked about the fact there that, but I didn't have any kind of experience. I was just speculating that as far as bilingualism is concerned, the further the two cultures and languages are away from each other, the better and stronger the bilingualism is. So absolutely very clear for me that the Korean bilinguals are better than the others. The Korean bilingual will be better than a Dutch English bilingual or a German English bilingual or even a French German bilingual, because if the two cultures are far from each other, and you know they have different way of thinking, they have different rewired conceptual ways, they have different writing systems, definitely if these two absolutely different sides are blended, the result is something much more powerful than when you blend like Dutch and English, which is so close culturally and linguistic. You know, there is no change in your mind if you are a British person and you study Dutch. You know, so or the same thing. You know, if you are a Russian and you study Czech. You know, so that there is no. However, if you're Chinese or a Vietnamese and you study English, which linguistically different, culturally different, everything, that's a powerful bilingualism. If you get to a higher level, you know, nowadays in America, the one of the biggest issues is that universities do not want to have any more Asian students, especially Harvard, Yale, Princeton, because you know if they look at the results, the GRA results, the Asians will much better than anybody else. Yeah, it makes sense, you know, absolutely makes sense because of this type of bilingualism, that what they bring into the bilingual plate, you know, much more than, you know, the French English bilingual or whatever, you know. So definitely educational systems is also play a role, but in my opinion, the most important thing is that how far the two cultures and languages are from each other. Of course, even here, when we make that distinction, we have to be very careful because there are some factors that modify what I say. I speak about not only linguistic typology, but psychotypology as well. Because linguistic typology means that, you know, if we take Chinese and English, they are absolutely typologically different languages, you know. So they are almost uncomparable. Of course, there are some elements like, you know, the word order, you know, because word order is strict in Chinese and in English as well, but for different reasons. of course, the typological difference between German and English is very little because, you know, English is a Germanic language, basically. So after all, this is the linguistic typology, and there is a psychotypology, and that's also important because so psychologically, the bilingual, the individual learner, how close that person feels that culture to himself when he learns that language. Why is it important? For example, let's take the situation Finnish and Swedish. Swedish language typologically is a West Germanic language, just like English. That's why that's the reason why the Swedes speak the best English in the world. You know, and the Finnish is a Finno-Ugric language, which is entirely different because Finnish is very agglutinative and it is related to Estonian and Hungarian. So the typologically, the two languages are absolutely different. However, if since they live side by side, so Finland has a very long border with Sweden, and basically in Finland, Swedish is an official language, and in Sweden, Finnish is an official language. So in spite of the fact that linguistically they are very far, culturally they are very close. So if you ask a Finnish person, which language do you think is easier for you to learn, Swedish or Hungarian? The Finnish person will say Swedish, in spite of the fact that Swedish typologically is very far from Finnish, and Hungarian is very close to Finnish. But culturally, they feel closer because they live side by side there, you know. So after all, it is, and when we talk about bilingualism, we could kind of look into that. I would be very happy to develop an experiment to prove this point, you know, when we would examine bilinguals where the two languages and cultures are very far, like Vietnamese and English, and bilinguals where the two languages and cultures are very close, like Dutch and English, Swedish and English, and so on. Or something in the middle, you know, which is like English and Singaporean, for example, you know, where we would, what we would do is to measure somehow based on some set of variables, the quality of the advantage of bilingualism on these people on doing things with languages, like, you know, here in this paper, basically. So after all, that's one of the most interesting findings of this paper, that the Koreans were the best. But I do not think that the explanation is the best. They know that this is something around the culture, but their guess is that it may be the education system, it may be the writing system or something like that. But the real point is the great difference between the two, because for your mind, that's the best thing, you know, that makes your mind work, you know. Otherwise, if the information that comes into your mind that is very close to what is already there, your mind is lazy, you know. The mind may not necessarily notice those slight differences. However, if there is boom, something, you know, really different, then you react to that. Then you react to that. That activates something, you know, that makes things move and around and so on. So after all, you know, these factors really affect bilingualism and what bilingualism is all about. You know, so I agree with the outcome of the article that we have to revisit the advantages of bilingualism, because most of the research has been in psycholinguistic research, you know, and not necessarily production research. You know, what do the bilinguals produce? What do the bilinguals do better, because in these exercises they just have to do some kind of small things, and that's not serious, at least for me. Okay, what do you think?
Do you want me to do the third question or move on?
No, I still want the other. What do they think about this kind of differences between bilinguals? Closer or further closeness of culture and language. Davindi, what do you think? We are just sitting there and do not say anything today. I mean, you are having a relaxed time, so think a little bit.
Yeah, I've been thinking of just what you said. But Professor, so when I started like learning French, I felt like it's closer to English than to Sinhala, than my native language, because like from even English and Sinhala, they're like totally different. I had to like learn grammar and everything from the beginning. But like French is closer to English. So that actually helped me to learn like grammar, like the linguistic part, and like other culture as well, because English and my culture, they are different, and from France also, like they are very different. So I've been thinking about that.
But that made you a better language learner, I think, because you said that through English you could go closer to French. Yes, but not through your own language, which is also different from both English and French. Quite a bit. Sinhalese is different. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So now, Elizabeth, let's go to the third question.
Okay, so it says this study focused on British and Korean cultures. Can you think of any other cultures that could be studied to determine cultural advantages in executive functioning? So different types of cultures for different specific reasons why, they might have different executive functioning abilities.
How about Turkish, Arabic? The problem is that there are a little number of studies, as far as bilingualism is concerned. Of course, most of the studies are connected with English and. We do not know too much about German and, French and, or the other way around, Chinese. And right now, there are Chinese scholars have been studying seriously some Chinese bilingualism, not only with English, but with German, French, Italian mainly. I have seen some with Italian, because Italians are very eager to have Chinese students at their universities. So right now, Chinese-Italian bilingualism is something, that several people publish on. So definitely there are several other cultures there, that could be examined as far as executive function is concerned. So we would kind of need to look into that, but there are not too many people. These bilingual studies, we have very restrictive methodology here. We would need a new kind of data collection methodology if we want to get a real answer about bilingual advantages. We do not have those methodologies yet.
Yeah, so I feel like the field of psycholinguistic has been, dominate the bilingualism study. And basically when we talk about executive functioning, I feel like it's not just only one action, like pressing the button or something. When we monitor something, I think it should be a series, like a process of actions, from planning, formulating, to producing, and kind of this study also saw that if we just compare bilingual in terms of the accuracy, then it will show disadvantage rather than advantage. So I hope that we can find methodology that is more holistic and that take into consideration the natural process of how bilingual function in reality. And in this class, I feel like we emphasize more about the conceptual fluency. I think conceptual fluency is also correlate with how that's a people think or reflect or monitor their reaction is also as important as their linguistic productions. So we need necessarily like a holistic procedure to look at the big picture than just only one the contextualized actions of a bilingual. That's what I think.
Yeah, and if you accept that bilinguals are divergent thinkers, and field independent thinkers, we of course cannot expect them to be accurate too much, on a monolingual task, for example, or on a task that is based on mainly monolingualism somehow. That's for sure.
Yeah, and then this really made me think about what Kathleen shared in her presentation about when we do assessment for bilingual student in our class. So basically, teachers is also like researchers. I think this class can, what do you guys think about, how we assess the student in a different way than not just using monolingual task in order to test them, for example. So I think there can be some connections about the implication of such studies in reality practice. And I don't know what Elizabeth think about that as a person who you are a practitioner, right? And reading this very empirical study about bilinguals and bilingual assessment, like, I don't know, maybe you can share, what you think.
I think it's a little trickier for me because the vast majority of my students right now, they all speak English and that's their dominant language and that's the only language they've learned. Caitlin has a more diverse group of students than I do. I have had students in the past that had spoken other languages, but my current school is very English dominant. But I did have students in my past school where they came in speaking different languages. And, it was kind of ridiculous that they already spoke their first language and now they're learning English. And then they got thrown into my Spanish class. So they're learning a third language on top of all the other things that were happening. So yeah, I definitely think it would be better if we could, test their first language abilities to allow them to at least get out of the, foreign language class that they're in, which would be my class, to, throw a third language on top of that. That's definitely been a huge discussion for me in my past experiences. So
If I could add to that, I think some of the toughest parts is when a kid is learning English because their first language isn't it, and they're in my class. So then they're overwhelmed with learning Spanish and English on top of their dominant language that they came from recently. And like, not many people do anything about it. But like, how can you even do that when I'm teaching the language English to Spanish and they don't know the words in that language of English? So then I like, you don't even know where to start with them at times.
Okay. Fang Wang, you teach Chinese here, yes, in America?
Yes.
Okay, so what's your experience with the American students? Because you teach Chinese to them. So how about their bilingualism? How is their bilingualism being shaped? Do you teach only elementary students or you teach also intermediate students?
I have been teaching adults and college students.
Yeah, but at the elementary level or intermediate level?
All levels.
All levels.
Yeah, I have been teaching all levels from elementary to advanced.
Mm-hmm. But what do you think about the advanced group? So are they really advanced? What do you think about their bilingualism? So because, these are American students who study Chinese in a school environment, And do you think that they start to understand and start to kind of conceptualize what Chinese is all about, or only they just learn the words and expressions in Chinese and try to kind of build up some sentences?
In advanced class, there are two kinds of students. One is heritage students and one is non-heritage students. But I think for heritage students in advanced level, I think they are kind of balanced bilingual.
Mhm.
Yeah, and before I ask them, do you think you are a Chinese or American? They all most of them said both. But if I ask the same question in the elementary level for heritage students, they think, I think I'm an American because I like American food, I watch American movies. So I always thinking of a question, if second language level impact on bilingual identities. And for non-heritage students, their Chinese, to be honest, their Chinese is much lower than heritage students. They are learners. And some, and I think most of them is in the additive period, not go to the
Synergic.
yes. So there are difference. Okay. And for this article, actually, I have a question. I think previous studies to test if bilinguals have higher executive functioning they are based on the linguistic relativity hypothesis, right? And for this, I think this study is not based on this hypothesis.
Mhm.
So for this, I think just okay, maybe my bill is not right. If researchers believe linguistic relatively hypothesis, I think they will think languages will shape bilinguals' cognitive, and because of language, because of both because of multiple language, so they have the higher executive function. But if researchers believe that, not only because languages, for example, this article, they give culture this this element. So I think we cannot have one answer, just depend on researchers' different opinions.
Okay, Elizabeth, do you have any comments on this? What Fang Gong said?
I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, they tried to stay in line with what past studies have done by using the Simon task. But like Han said, that only tests one specific skill, the ability to press the keys at a specific amount of time, which I would agree. That's kind of what I was getting at with my fourth question on there. That might not be the best way to measure your executive functioning skills because it's just one task measuring that one thing. So I don't think it's the best way to measure that, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, that's a good opinion. So, well, basically, you're right. Okay, guys, so I think that we gonna have to stop here. But before we go, so next week,